Hello, I'm Paul Bew, and the title of my talk is going to be Home Rule and the Ulster Crisis. In 1913, the celebrated journalist at the London Times, W.F. Moneypenny, wrote a book called The Two Irish Nations. And in that book he remarks, in a striking passage, Irish history is a constant tragedy, a tragedy in the deeper sense, not as a clash of right and wrong, but as the clash of two rights. And I would suggest that is a helpful way of looking at the Home Rule crisis. The union of Great Britain and Ireland in 1800 and 1801 undoubtedly reflected what will be called today a selfish strategic interest on the part of Britain. British statesmen openly confessed to having been frightened by the French invasion of 1798 in support of the revolt of the United Irishmen, and the United Irishmen had support from Presbyterians in Antrim and Catholics in Wexford. The scale of the crisis exposed the inadequacy of the Irish Parliament to provide stable government in Ireland and its inability to provide a framework for the development of Irish society. In the mind of the Prime Minister William Pitt, an idea formed. Now that idea went beyond purely the strategic question of protecting Britain. He was influenced by the great British political thinker with Irish roots, Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke had developed a critique, particularly in the 1790s, of Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. And Burke's point was an ascendancy of a particular grouping in society is particularly unbearable when it has a democratic tail. When there are lots of ordinary people in relatively low rungs of life who consider themselves superior to another group in the society. And that he's regarded as essentially intolerable. And he argued instead that you should have to create a situation in which there was a unity between England and Ireland to bring about progress. Burke's phrase was, you cannot speak as a good Irishman with also speaking as a good Englishman, and you cannot speak as a good Englishman with also speaking simultaneously as a good Irishman. And Pitt repeats that when he brings in the Act of Union. The idea in principle is you provide a framework for stability and economic growth and equality of religions over time. Now, of course, one of the things that goes wrong immediately is the promise of Catholic emancipation is disappointed and is delayed for a generation. And Irish people, or Irish Catholics at any rate, learn the idea that if you want to get justice from Britain, you have to agitate. There's no point in just waiting for gentle hints of kind action from British statesmen to be fulfilled, because it won't happen without exerting pressure. Very important lesson. But it's important also to understand that the economic growth that came to Ireland, and it did come in the 19th century, came mainly to the Protestant northeast. Catholic Ireland in the south and west endured the famine of 1846 to 1850, in which 1 million people died. Now, the failure of the potato crop in that year is a natural disaster. It's not a deliberate act of genocide. But on the other hand, it is a huge moral and political failure for the concept of the Union and for the implied promise of progress to Ireland, which it embodied. This explains, to a very large degree, the success of a populist nationalism in 19th century Ireland. But these developments help to explain why Northern Protestants and Presbyterians, for whom the Union essentially worked as advertised in providing religious equality, economic growth, all the things they felt they were being denied in the late 18th century, why those groups turned away from the significant interest in separatist ideas which had influenced them in the late 18th century. The general election of 1885 revealed stark difference in Ireland. All seats which had Catholic majorities returned nationalist candidates. All seats which had Protestant majorities returned unionist candidates. Stark sectarian topography of political choice, absolutely clear in the country. There are complexities and subtleties here. There's a very interesting letter from the great radical Republican but turned moderate Home Ruler J.J. O'Kelly, a military man in his youth, a Fenian, to Irish-American leader John Devoy in 1882, in which he says, you've got to understand Irish politics requires careful handling. It's not how it always seems from New York. And he says there are five, they take the population of Ireland. He says 1 million Protestants are against nationalist ideas, and perhaps 500,000 Catholics have accepted the idea that the Union is about progress and religious equality, and they're also against us. So it's a complicated story, but the fact of the matter is that by the mid-1880s, the democratic voice of the majority of Ireland looked as if it had decided for Home Rule, and the British Prime Minister of the day, W.E. Gladstone, felt he had no choice but to respond to the demand for a Dublin Parliament. He had been embarrassed indeed by the fact that in 1881 he had been the head of a government which had had to intern 1,000 suspects during the Land War, because it really struck at his own self-image as a liberal man who followed the rule of law. And he didn't like having to have had done that, and he certainly was not willing to stand in the face of a popular declaration at the polls in favour of some form of Dublin Parliament in the great majority of Irish seats. But equally, the northeast corner stood out against this. Gladstone had many close Liberal followers in Belfast, Liberal followers who in the 1870s had criticised Gladstone because he had published anti-Catholic pamphlets. And the Liberals in Belfast said, we don't want to hear all this anti-Catholic talk because we work with Catholics. But these same people were told 10 years later that because they didn't want Home Rule, that they were bigots. So it was an incredible tension between all forms of Protestant politics in the Northeast, whether traditionally conservative or orange or liberal and Presbyterian, and Gladstone from 1885, 1886 onwards. It's fairly clear, for example, in remarks he makes at the time of the Second Home Rule Bill on May the 5th, 1893, that Gladstone was open to some kind of idea that maybe you left the northeast corner out of any operation of a Home Rule Bill. He certainly hints at that in Parliament on May the 5th, 1893. So it's fairly clear that he was open to discussion on this point, but discussion never really seriously develops on that, because many Irish Unionists want to prevent Home Rule for the whole of Ireland, and the House of Lords has the power to stop Home Rule being implemented for the whole of Ireland, as it does at the time of the 1893 Home Rule Bill. Now, the key issue for Irish nationalists after 1893 is a clear one. Home Rule has passed the House of Commons, but it can't get through because of the House of Lords. And Irish nationalism enters into a kind of internal debate about the implications of this. John Redmond said, as the leader of the Parnell minority, pay attention to what Parnell said in his last great speech at Belfast in May 1891, where Parnell began what John Hume was later to see as the beginning of the consent principle in Irish politics, when he says that that it's absolutely necessary to conciliate the interests of Northern Protestants. Whether they're right or wrong, the only strategy for Irish nationalists, ever since Wolfe Tone this has been recognised, he claimed, is to conciliate them. Otherwise, the project of Irish unity will have upon it what he called a fatal clog and a fatal drag. So Redmond said the key thing was to have an internal policy of toleration and forget about the House of Lords, because anyway, change is not going to come to its powers for a long time. John Dillon, on the other hand, said the key thing is to agitate with English radicals to break the power of the House of Lords. By 1910, Redmond, however, had changed his mind, because the House of Lords' power was actually broken by radical pressure, and he was able to employ the Irish influence at Westminster to see that in February 1912, a Home Rule Bill, the third Home Rule Bill, was introduced. A bill which inflamed feeling in Northern Ireland and led to a mobilisation of considerable militancy, but no real violence against the prospect of the imposition of Home Rule in what is now the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. It's important to understand this. The Liberal government felt it had to offer Redmond a 32-county Home Rule, but in actual practice, in its heart, it's perfectly clear from the Cabinet minutes, it believed that at some stage or other, Redmond would see how upset people were in North East Ulster, and he would agree to some form of exemption for North East Ulster. And that, crudely speaking, is what happened. Carson had one key insight as the leader of the Ulster Unionists when he said, does anybody want to actually govern a conquered people? You might smash our resistance by some means or another to the project of Home Rule, but does the British government want to govern a conquered people? Does an Irish Parliament want to govern a conquered people? And John Dillon, for example, as the senior leader of the Irish Party, says quite clearly, well, actually, with our record against coercion, how could we possibly impose coercion against another people in the northeast? So partition emerges. On what terms, it's not clear. How large the area excluded might be is not clear for some years, but it's quite clear that partition is coming forward as the settlement of the Home Rule crisis with a substantial measure of nationalist consent. And what you see again is the operation of what we've come to call the principle of consent. Don't forget, in the remnant way of thinking about things, Irish MPs would still have been sitting at Westminster, so they would have had a say in the way in which Northern Ireland was governed. Obviously, when you get a Sinn Féin solution later, that particular element disappears from the political scene. So partition emerges as a kind of a solution. It's very, very interesting to see Jim O'Callaghan TD, who is well known in Irish politics for his criticism of the current Taoiseach for not pushing hard enough the Irish unity agenda. Nonetheless, in his speech in Cambridge has said that actually, while he could not support partition when it happened, he does accept that it was a rational decision given the depth of division within the Irish people at the time. And it's really quite interesting that he should say that. The truth of the matter is, of course, that the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 offers, as a retrospective legitimization of the democratic basis of partition, however unhappy that democratic basis is, offers a retrospective legitimization as sure as the 1918 Sinn Féin election result in Dublin offered a democratic legitimation within nationalism of the 1916 Rising. There are two great retrospective democratic legitimizations of 20th century Ireland. Now, to conclude on the implications of partition, in February 1921, Edward Carson gave his resignation speech in Belfast as the leader of Ulster Unionism. Now, here I want to say something about Carson. One of the interesting points about his leadership during the Home Rule crisis was his speeches of awful honesty and frankness. So he would say drilling is illegal, whereas many other unionist lawyers believed, no, there was some clause in the statute that it wasn't. Carson never, ever went in for anything other than the most direct and honest language, even when it's embarrassing to his own side. However, this disappears, I think, as he eventually moves out of frontline political leadership. And if you look again at his resignation speech, for example, there are things which you look at and you feel somewhat uneasy about as he hands over to James Craig as the new leader of Ulster Unionism. One of the things is when he talks about the Home Rule, the struggle of unionists against not just Home Rule now, but Sinn Féin. And he says there's never, ever been an action during this conflict which was worse than a street brawl. Well, if you were one of the Catholic and indeed labour workers expelled in the summer of 1920, and there were some thousands from the shipyards, you'd think, well, that's just not true. And Carson starts to slip into saying things, gilding the lily, which was not a characteristic of his earlier period. There were things that had happened. And of course, what happens in the shipyard expulsions is a context given it by very severe and mounting IRA violence. But there were things that happened which are worse than a street brawl. And this is if you consider the terms on which he hands over, this is the kind of, these are the worrying problems which are going to be there for unionism. He also slips into a kind of attitude towards the situation in the rest of Ireland, which is frankly simply not realistic. He believed, because the British Army was doing, and it was doing, and intelligence services relatively well against the IRA in the summer of 21, they should just have pressed on for a complete victory and smashed the Republican movement in the South. Now, British statesmen believe we're doing relatively well. They're now willing to compromise. We don't want a complete military victory. It's pointless. It would disgrace our soldiers by the means it would have to be done. We don't want to do this, and we'd have the political problem to deal with anyway at the end of it all, so let's just deal with the negotiation now. Carson never accepted that logic. James Craig did. James Craig in May 1921 made himself the servant of the peace faction and people like Andy Cope in Dublin Castle, the British government, and went to see Eamon de Valera in a crucial and physically very dangerous meeting, precisely because he did believe in dialogue and negotiation from early on in 1921 to bring about peace. A peace which he knew would be unsatisfactory, but better than a continuing war. But Carson seems to want, and that's why he makes that famous speech about what a fool I was and how he was betrayed by the Conservative Party when he arrives in the House of Lords. Carson seemed to want, if his position meant anything at all, continuing war. And other people in British politics, and indeed in the Ulster Unionist leadership, thought, no, we have to go for a stable settlement, which will have bad sides to it for everybody. Now, the obvious question that looms is the question of discrimination. Carson, in that February 1921 speech, says that we must reach out to the best, when Northern Ireland is set up, the best on the other side, and allow them to come over to us. And the question is, did they ever really do this? People often talk about the way the Northern Irish state behaved, sometimes very harshly, without reference to the context of violence and threat that it always had to live with. There's a very interesting passage from the Nationalist MP for 10 years in Galway, Stephen Gwynn, saying you have to remember that Sinn Féin had honeycombed the British service in Ireland with persons who thought it entirely reasonable to actually conspire actively and help to assassinate people that they work with. And you can't possibly expect James Craig, when he becomes the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, to forget all that when they're employing people, for example, to work in the police and in the Ministry of Home Affairs. Simple and obvious comment on human behaviour coming from a Nationalist MP. On the other hand, can one reasonably say that the Unionist regime reached out to the best on the other side that made it possible for them to come over and live with the regime? I have a very uneasy feeling about this. During lockdown, like a lot of people, I've been looking at my family history. I always knew my great-uncle was a Catholic priest. What I discovered was that he was one of the longest-serving Catholic chaplains in the British Army in the First World War, that he was torpedoed, that he was with Allenby in Jerusalem, that he had many medals by the end of the war. I wondered if instead of coming back to Ireland and coming to Belfast to work out the rest of his career, he actually went back to London, would he have been seen as one of the best on the other side and brought over? I can't be absolutely sure. Looking at the archives of the Stormont Ministry, which I worked on extensively, there were certainly some people who worked in that ministry who would have wanted to bring somebody like that over, and there were equally others who did not have that imagination to bring somebody like that over. Now, one final point looking ahead from that moment in 1921. It's just worth realizing nobody had a crystal ball. All the assumptions that were made about the future of Northern Ireland, very few of them actually came to pass. Everybody on all sides, British, Irish, Nationalist, Unionists, believed that if Northern Ireland could not pay for itself, it was doomed. And yet Northern Ireland never paid for itself, not really. And 100 years later, it's still here. And the fact that it couldn't pay for itself turned out to be one of its strengths. The fact that the Union delivered material support and therefore better standards of living as a function of the Union for both communities throughout the century turned out to be one of its strengths. But nobody actually predicted that. Everyone was sure, the Unionists felt, that we'll be all right because Belfast in 1920 was one of the world's leading industrial cities. Some people say the world's leading industrial city. We'll be all right, we'll make the money, we'll be able to pay for our services, we'll be able to pay for the upkeep of the Imperial Civil Service, we'll be able to transfer money to London. That's what the Unionists hoped. It really never really worked out like that, especially in the 1930s. It really didn't work out like that, and effectively, while sometimes there are references to an imperial contribution being paid, it's a polite fiction. But in the end, the logic of the existence of the Union meant that however uneasy the London Treasury was, it was always the case that the decision was made that it was better to transfer the funds to Northern Ireland rather than to see hardship on the Falls or the Shankill. This is the logic of the Union, but not one that was ever expected by anybody in 1921. Nationalists were sure the Unionists couldn't pay their own way, the whole system would fall. Unionists were sure that if they couldn't pay their own way, the whole system would fall. Actually, they didn't pay their own way, And it turned out to be one of the most important sources and resources of strength, and one of the reasons why we have now had 100 years of the existence of Northern Ireland. And it's also a warning fact as we try to look ahead. Nobody had a crystal ball then about the future of Northern Ireland. Nobody has a crystal ball now about the future of Northern Ireland.